Dr. Michael Kuppinger began his career as an engineer and recently earned his PhD in values-driven leadership. His doctoral research points toward teams as the fundamental organizing principle of successful 21st century organizations. Dr. Michael Kuppinger.
I think there's a lot of things that we can learn about our society by looking at sports. And one of those things is you look at the Major League Baseball managers and they're looking for that one superstar to create the winning team. And you know, very similar to how business leaders look for that one individual instead of look to the team to create that winning performance. That's very evident when you look at player salaries. The top 10 players in National League Baseball are making between $24 and $32 million, while the other starters on the team, not the junior guys, but the other starters on the field are making between $1 and $5 million. So the question is, are these players that make $20, $30 million, are they really worth it? And comparing that back to business. So let's look at what happened last year. The Kansas City Royals, they have a total team salary of $114 million, but no superstars on their team. All pretty good players. They won the World Series. Now let's compare that to the LA Dodgers, who had a total salary income of $273 million, 2.5 times what Kansas City is. Now they have several of these top players. Unfortunately, they haven't won the World Series in 28 years. So, but maybe last year was just a freak situation. So I looked over the last 20 years and found that, very seldom do these top superstars end up on the World Series teams. And so another thing I found that looking over the last 20 years is that when you take the average of the World Series winners based on salary average of the team, it comes out to be ranked 8th. And it only varies between about 7.8 and about 9.2. And so to me, the lesson learned from that is that better players give a higher chance of winning teams, but the superstars actually maybe become a barrier to being a World Series winner. So I applied this I found the same thing, I guess, in my research on teams, is that managers were looking for these superstars to come in and save the day instead of using the value of teams. And when I sit back and look at, there's probably no more evidence of what's happened in society as what we've seen in baseball. When you look at some of the most influential people of our last century. If you go back to the 1950s and 60s, where I think society was much more collaborative. You think of speeches from John F. Kennedy, from Martin Luther King in 1961, 63, where they were pulling the nation together. Unfortunately, as the century turned 2000, 2001, and 2008, characters like Bernie Madoff and Enron's Jeff Schilling, were where I think was the very peak of individualization. So what I've seen is that this trend is starting to improve. And so the good news is that the business community is looking for improvement. And one of the things in my research is I looked at the individualization index value, which has been changing. It was going up steady from 1950 up until recent times and started to change. And so I want to talk about some of those key changes. One of the major changes is that in 1970, there was about 15% of women in the workforce. Today, there's closer to 45%. And I found a lot of research that said multi-gender teams are much more effective than only men or only women teams. One of the biggest factors I found is that the millennials are making a significant impact. Millennials are much more collaborative in nature. They're much more family-orientated, and they look for meaning and purpose in their career much more so. In fact, there's been a lot of parallels from the millennial generation back to the greatest generation when we were a more collaborative society. And so the last key thing from the index is that the divorce rate continued up pretty steadily. In fact, it doubled from 1950 to 1980, and it's had a continuous downturn and has almost recovered, not quite to back where it was in the 50s and 60s. So let me talk about my specific research that I did. I partnered with PSMJ, who does surveys over the last 40 years, and looked at architecture and engineering firms. And we selected 5 of the top firms, and I went from Toronto to Houston, all over interviewed 50 people. And some of the key things that I found during my research was, I found 3 major things where teams enable individuals to flourish and also enable companies to be profitable. The number one thing is that these organizations were built by people who cared for their mission. They understood why they were there, they cared about the work that was being done, and they were committed to it. The other thing is that they cared for their teammates. This actually created somewhat of a dual force that kept them in a balance. It forced them to be committed to getting the work done. It also, held their teammates accountable, but the passion for their teammates allowed their teammates to make mistakes now and then. And the second thing is member interdependence. When teams created interdependence with each other, they continued to improve. The first step of interdependence is sharing skills and tasks on that side of it, and then there's a behavioral independence that they evolve to, where they're committed, they're motivating each other, and they're encouraging each other and backing each other up. The third, and probably the most interesting thing I've discovered, is that conflict was not high anxiety to them. They embraced conflict, and they turned conflict into continuous learning opportunities. So I found that teams, and they needed to evolve to this point. Teams first needed to care about each other and their mission. They needed to create this interdependence, because this interdependence caused them to create decisions together and to own the outcomes together. And when they did these things, then all of a sudden, conflict looked like an external entity for them. And so Margaret Mead was a great anthropologist and quite a bit ahead of her time. And I've got a quote from her that I think really sums it up. "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful citizens can change the world. Indeed, that's the only thing that ever has." And I will end with the title of my dissertation, because I believe that teams are the fundamental unit for the 21st century organizational performance. Thank you.